So the last part of chapter 4 is going to be looking at converting between fractions and decimals. So let's say you got 5 out of 8 on a quiz and you wanted to know what percentage that was. Well, you know the fraction 5 over 8 really means 5 divided by 8. So let's do it over here on the side. So 5 divided by 8. Okay, we can't go even once, so let's add a 0 on. Remember, if you've got a whole number, you can add as many zeros on after the decimal place as you need. So now we've got 8 into 50, that would go 6 times. 6 times 8 is 48. And so we get 2 when we subtract. Let's carry down a 0. And now we say, how many times can 8 fit into 20? That could go 3 times. Nope, it can't. That would be 24. It can only go 2 times, which would be 16. And so we're left with a 4. Let's drop down another 0. How many times can 8 go into 40? It can go 5 times. And now we have no remainder. Let's put our decimal in. So our decimal is right there. So we get 625 thousandths. Or if you were going to write this as a percent, you won't know this quite yet maybe, but we can convert to percent by multiplying by 100. We'll go over that more in chapter 6, but it's a nice little glimpse at that chapter. And so we end up with 62.5% on our quiz. There are 2 types. So we've just converted a fraction to a percent, or to a, well, we'll say we've converted a fraction to a decimal. Then we ended up taking that decimal and putting it into a percent, but that's just kind of an added little extra thing for later. So when we're going from a fraction to a percent, or sorry, fraction to a decimal, 2 things can happen. We're either going to have a terminating decimal, like we did in this case, where eventually we ended up with a 0 as a remainder, like we got over here. Okay, so in other words, our 625 thousandth is sort of the full answer. The other thing you can have is a repeating decimal. And this is where you're never going to get to the very end of your decimal answer. So you might end up with an answer of 0.3333, where the 3 just goes on forever. So that would be a repeating decimal. So let's try some of these. Let's write 7 over 8 as a decimal. So to do that, we have to do the division. So 7 divided by 8. And let's add a 0 on here. Okay, that would go 8 times. Here's 64. And now let's drop down another 0. How many times does 8 go into 60? So that would go 7 times for 56. And that leaves us with 4. We can drop down another 0. And 40 will go into 8 will go into 40 5 times. And we have no remainder left. So once we add our decimal in here, it's going to go right here. That's our final answer. Our final answer then is 875 thousandths. So that is an example of a terminating decimal. All right. Why don't you give the video a pause and try B on your own? All right, and let's do B together. So we've got 5 divided by 20. Okay, so I'm going to have to add a decimal and a 0 here. 20 would go into 50 2 times, leaving us with 10 left over. Let's drop another 0. 20 would go into 100 5 times evenly, so we have nothing left over. So this is another case of a terminating decimal, and our answer then is 25 hundredths. All right, let's try 2 over 3. So that's the same thing. That means 2 divided by 3. So we'll add our decimal 0 there. 3 can go into 20, how many times? 6 times for 18. And we have 2 left over. Let's drop down a 0. Now we have to wonder, okay, how many times can 3 go into 20? Once again, it can go 6 times for 18, and we're left with 2. Let's drop down a 0. Once again, we have a 20. And so maybe you can see that no matter how many times we drop down the 0, we're always going to get a 6 up here. It's always going to be 20, which will go 6 times. So our answer is 0.666 for an infinite amount of 6s. It just goes on forever. So we can actually write this as 0.6 bar like that. That's a notation, which means this 6 goes on forever. You could also round this. So if you, for instance, were asked to round to the nearest hundredth, you could say your answer is 67 hundredths. All right, why don't you give the video a pause and try that next one? Okay, let's try this one together now. So we've got 7 divided by 12. So I'm going to add another 0 here. How many times does 12 go into 70? Would go 5 times. 5 times 12 is 60. So now I've got 10, and I'm going to add another 0. So how many times would 12 go into 100? Well, if you've worked in a lab, that's an easy one, I believe it or not, because you always deal with rows of 12 times 8, which gives you 96 wells, at least in the lab I worked in. So it's okay if you don't know that one by the top of your head. That's the only reason I knew it. Okay, I'm going to have to do some carrying here. And I get 4. So now let's drop down another number. How many times does 12 fit into 40? I would go 3 times. 3 times 12 is 36. So I end up with a 4 again. Drop down a 0. How many times does 12 go into 40? 3 times for 36. And maybe you see a pattern here. So once again, I'm going to get a 4. No matter how many times I do it, I'm going to keep getting 4s. And so our answer then is going to continue on with 3s forever. So we could write this as 0.583 bar like that to show that that 3 goes on forever.